Hey everybody, this is going to be our first online lecture. I know this is a little weird, but I think that it's easier for me to go through this slideshow with you in a video. I'm recording all of the text here, so you'll also have a transcript of this. This is going to be a slideshow. I'll post this video of us going through the slideshow, and I'll also post the slideshow itself in Google Slides. So our next project was going to be a relief printing project. We were going to be carving linoleum blocks and printing them. Obviously, that's a little out of the question, so our next project, as you can see, is actually going to be a drawing assignment. So I posted a couple videos for you to watch. You can watch those after this. We're just going to start by looking at some images of relief printing and kind of look at how different artists are using mark and approaching the blocks. So this image is from our first artist. This is Max Beckman, Group Portrait 1923. It's a woodcut, so you can see we have some of the texture from the wood still in the image. When we're talking about mark making, we really want to pay attention to this area here and these areas here. We can see that in these images, the artist is making a grayscale or a mid-tone through cross-hatching and through kind of simplifying marks. Specifically, like I'm looking at right here, the way that he's using really fine line and really thin line to kind of scratch out a gray tone. When we're working with relief and linoleum, it's all subtractive. Everything we take out will remain white and everything we leave in would remain dark. Normally we'd be carving with a tool, but obviously we're not going to be doing that. So if we think back to when we were doing our dry point, we don't have as much range as a drawing where we could, lighten our hand or, put more pressure down to create a mark. We really just kind of have a black and white dichotomy. So that's why it's really important to think about cross-hatching and mark. I'm looking too at the face here on this figure and the way that Beckman is using the direction of lines. I think we kind of talked about this when we were doing our dry points originally. How are we shaping a face and how are we giving form to something? And we're doing that here through directionality of our lines. We have lines coming up, then we have lines moving to the side. Same with right here to form her cheekbone. We have lines that are cutting down and then coming back up a little bit. Look at the rounding of this hair. Another thing we want to pay attention to is how we're using the outline of the figure. We see this very subtle line kind of dropped in along the cheek. Same with these figures. These areas could get really messy really easily, but the way that Beckman is kind of intersecting, and you can see too, this line isn't even continuous. It's like, that's a line, that's a mark, that's a mark, that's a mark, that's a mark, kind of replicating what we have going on here. The way that he's using those marks to create difference is kind of how he's able to give depth and range to these forms. Also, let's look down here too. We have what appears to be mostly black, and that little kind of hint of a highlight of his shoulder is really just given through these very fine lines that are drawn down. Let's go to the next one. So then now we have Felix Vallotton, someone who's not using a lot of tone. He's using almost no gray tone or no grayscale. That's where we see right here. His marks are pretty flat. We have these whole sections of just black space. Same with these trees, same with these people. And he's using different types of information. We're looking at the grass here. When we're carving in a linoleum block, like we said before, everything that is white has been carved out. So that means that he's trying to figure out or strategizing. He's carving out all of this space and just leaving these really small marks. So he's kind of working in a counterintuitive way to how we'd maybe approach a drawing. For drawing, we'd start with a blank piece of paper and we'd draw in these small marks. We have to figure out how we're going to carve around to form these marks. Looking here too on this leg, seeing how this white line was carved out these white lines were carved out. These black marks are formed, again, not by drawing specific marks, but by drawing around these forms. Especially I'm looking right here, the way this shoulder is formed. And down here with this shoe, all the directions, or the directionality of these lines. It's used to create form and create depth. This is Emil Noldi. So again, this is a very different approach because he's leaving in a lot of information. This work, everything that we see here is carved out, so he's leaving in these really small marks. And this is very, he doesn't have a ton of midtone. We can see midtone here and midtone in the face here. I think I want to draw your attention to this image though, and looking at the size of these marks. He's creating distance through the work. He's giving us like a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And he's just doing that by changing the size of the forms. The forms in front remain really large and big and a little bit more organic. And as we move back, we can see not only are the black forms kind of shrinking and kind of being pulled out and being spread thin, but we can see that the white forms are as well. And he's pushing those forms closer together. We have like big white space here, as to where somewhere like up here, we have very thin line, very thin mark, and they're very close together. And we want to think about those visual tricks kind of as we're working through these to create depth and create distance and space. This is Jose Guadalupe Posada. So another approach, very, very fine lines, very thin. We have very few areas where there's lots of black space being left in, like maybe just this area and maybe this area. But let's look at, in this hat, if we look at how it shapes around to give us a curve, we can see that these were kind of a series of marks. Like these were a series of marks, and then he kind of uses this line as a place marker to change directions. Now we have a different direction for our marks, and now we have a different direction for our marks, and again, and he's doing that as he's carrying through the whole hat. Areas like this could be really confusing if we don't plan or we don't really think about how we're gonna create these marks. But again, these really thin lines, he's carving around all of these really, really thin spaces. Same with here, same with down here. He's really utilizing cross-hatching again. This is all just one tone, not one tone, but he's not using gray ink, or he's not using a pencil. He's just using a variety of marks, of really thin marks and really bold marks. Same with here. And then we can see too, he's kind of changing the size. Like we have these really thin lines being used to create the ribs, and then kind of larger, thicker white lines to shape the pants. And then back down here to the bottom of this shoe. Again, everything that's white is being carved out, so he's really kind of going in there and working out these really fine squares and these really thin lines. Kathy Kolwitz, this one is great. So this one we're actually leaving a lot of that information and we're not really carving out a lot. I think this is a good example of seeing how we can kind of expand our idea of line. It's not just one flat, continuous line shaping these figures. We have it looks like they probably started with that, like they have a line coming along these faces, but then to kind of disrupt that and kind of disrupt it from just being, a clean cut line, they're going back in and putting in these directional marks that they really disrupt what would have just been like a plain line, and they really kind of give everything here an energy and a direction. We kind of see the kind of like the dynamism of those marks and kind of the energy and the excitement to them. They're very vertical, as to where everything else within these forms is a little bit more horizontal. And I think that this is creating a really stark contrast between figure and background. And then I think this is also a good example of having a work where we do leave a lot of black space in a page, but we're really utilizing the whole page. Like this area could have been left black, but instead we have this big white space carved out and using a variety of marks. So our eyes kind of pulled through, and it kind of reflects. We have the roundness up here being reflected in the roundness down there, to where those two forms together are really pushing our eye inward to look at the figure. So this is Elizabeth Catlett. So these are two different versions of the same print. This is probably the print that she puts on top, and then this print is either two additional pieces, like a piece to form the skin and a piece to form the jacket. There's a couple ways she could have done that. I think what's interesting about this is that a lot of the marks, they look like they're made with the same tool, but what she's really doing is she's really relying on the size and the quantity of those marks together to create tone and create space. And you can see she has so many tones happening here. She has all of this, she has the face here, she has the side of the nose. Keeping in mind too, we're really looking at the planes of this figure, this area being left flat and then being shaped by these marks. It would have been easy to probably either carve out this whole space as white, but we can see that the way that marks are kind of radiating out from the figure really gives us a range. And two, I think it's important to look at just the little hints like this, like she took out just enough along this shoulder to kind of create an edge, and then left just enough in on the figure. Our marks start about, right about here, a little further down on this side, but we get a sense of the roundness in the form of this figure as a result. Same with the neck. And then similar to the last hat that we saw, we have the direction of the mark in a circular pattern that's really giving what could have been a very flat shape a lot of texture and a lot of form, kind of volume. Valerie Luth. This one's a lot more illustrative, but it's obviously really fun, and I think that we can see how she's kind of sectioning out different marks, like, these little areas, these tufts of fur. The marks are relatively the same throughout, like this mark and that mark. They're pretty similar, but the way that she's dispersing them and the way that she's repeating them and then switching direction, like we see this mark repeated here, but then we see it flipped over right here. We kind of see that throughout. And then she's intersecting too in the front here. We see these kind of more open white spaces that she's kind of tucking in, as to where we see more black spaces in the back here. And I think that's really giving a very subtle difference to the front of this form than to the back. And she obviously chose to either carve out all of the space around this figure, or she cut her linoleum so that there was nothing there for ink to grab onto. We have a very, very minimal one here, Alejandro Laskovich. So I know we keep saying this, but all of this white space has been carved. So we can kind of see where this carving makes a little bit more sense in the buffalo face. We see marks and we see cutting. But right here is kind of where we see how selective he's being with his marks. We can see these really small forms. And again here, some of this is happening just from the texture of the linoleum being left in. But a lot of this is just selection, selecting to leave these forms in these spaces. And I mean selecting to leave in the texture of that linoleum as well. Franz Messeril. These ones are a little bit more, they're a little clean compared to something like what we just saw. We have very definitive black and white spaces. you know, there's not a ton of midtone in here, but we can see, specifically I think with the buildings, how he's pushing back space, and using, you know, like this is a window here, this is a window down there. We can see that those are really different in size. Same with this one. We're really breaking up what could have been empty white space with this texture and a lot of different design and tone and direction of mark. Kind of intersecting this form too with the curve, and just little accents here like around the head, little accents too that form the jacket and the shirt right in this area. This mark of the arm, I think, you know, it's very subtle. It's just one mark cut in. We kind of see it repeated here, but I think that I think those really subtle marks can be really effective. I'm looking too, and it's in the pants as well. But I think those really small marks, you know, they give our eye an understanding of direction, of how these limbs are moving. And it's enough to just kind of hint at us and enough to kind of suggest to us that this is how we should interpret this form. This is Olesia. Oh, I don't know if I can say that last name. Jureva. All of this is being done through really fine mark making. We see these really fine individual dots, and we see the different intensity throughout, like areas like here are a little bit more worked and then built up so we can have these white spaces as to where somewhere like this, you know, we have very few marks. We even have ones that are just kind of loners, like right here and right there. There's a couple spaces right here where she's maybe using line. She might also just be using very strategic dots put together. I think down here too as well we have some grass. But this is to kind of show you that, you know, a lot of these artists are using different tools and different sizes of marks, but then someone like this is not varying really the size of their mark at all. They're just accumulating marks and accumulating dots and stippling, but we can see how effective this is and how almost photographic it is. I'm looking too in this area where she's kind of building, they're kind of building from this white space to a more midtone, and how they kind of repeat that throughout this image, like looking around in this area as well. Okay, I think that's the end of our slideshow.